very much. Huge amount in there for us to digest, but very clear. Thank you very much. We're going to keep going. I know we're slightly behind schedule. We're going to catch up with ourselves a bit later, but we are going to move on for with our final speaker before we have a very short pause. So Simon Cronshaw, welcome from Culture Label. Are you both coming?
Hi, good morning. I'm also very pleased to announce that you got 2 for 1 this morning. So it's not just myself, Simon Cronshaw, it's also my business partner, Peter Tullin, and together we created Culture Label and Remix Summits that we'll talk to you in a little bit more detail about these next few minutes. Really, this section is about looking less at the supply side and more at demand side, and actually really understanding why we're doing all of this. And actually, we're very aware that there's an oversaturation of supply from both the cultural sector, the academic sector, a whole bunch of different sectors, where we're creating an awful lot of apps, we're creating an awful lot of websites, we're creating an awful lot of projects, but actually we're not necessarily tying that into demand. We're not understanding who it's for, who's going to use it, and actually ensuring that we get people, it's built around user needs, user expectations, and that we can get loyal audiences to use it. So this kind of mentality of build it and they'll come, we can say for certain they absolutely won't come unless we design it with them in mind. So really this presentation is looking at some great examples of demand-led innovation, really looking at examples where consumer understanding has informed the whole process of interest in innovation within content. So just to give you a bit of background, myself and Peter set up Culture Label about 6 years ago now, and really it's our own sort of cultural entrepreneurship journey. So we're speaking together as cultural entrepreneurs where we identified a trend in the market, in this case people demanding interesting gifts and affordable artwork. We understood our assets, we pulled together the nation's best museums and galleries, so we pulled together all the nationals in the UK, so people like Tate, V&A, Royal Academy, Saatchi Gallery, everyone else came together to work for the first time on an aggregated platform to sell the contents of the gift shop. And then we really understood how to then market it to the consumer audience, get it out there in magazines like Grazia, Elle Deco, Vogue and others to really get it into that consumer mentality. We then brought in VC funding as we started to see demand sort of really accelerating, and we grew it to a stage where just 4 days ago we actually sold it, and we've just exited. So we've really seen that kind of cycle of cultural entrepreneurship from idea through to implementation of that idea through to final exit and sort of creating value both culturally in terms of new income for organisations that we work with, and also commercially in terms of new revenue for our stakeholders. So we then also created Remix, which Peter...
Yeah, I'll talk about this. I've got to speak up here because otherwise Simon says silly things, so I'm just kind of here to keep him under control. Right, okay. And also I'm a bit taller, so I'll have to move that. Okay, so as part of our journey of cultural entrepreneurship, as Simon said, we created or authored 2 books, both of which you can get as free downloads online. Intelligent Naivety, which is particularly relevant today, is a handbook for the would-be creative entrepreneur. So it looks at the steps and the stages, whether you're working inside the cultural sector or outside of the walls increasingly, as people are creating sustainable creative enterprises in this area. And then Remix, which very much looks at the future of the cultural sector and creative cities and the creative economy, and looking at those disruptive forces and trends, as Simon mentioned, from the outside. They're obviously shaping the world in which we operate if we're based in the cultural space. So very quickly before we go on to the examples, where we've got lots of pretty pictures for you, we decided to do more pictures than text. A lot of our kind of position is coming from the point of view that we're really are trying to kind of break down the walls of cultural institutions, and clearly outside of our jobs, if you're sat here from the cultural institution, we're all consumers. We all recognise that lots of different industries have been disrupted by technologies, new consumer trends, and that's not going to change, and culture is no different. So 2.5 years ago we teamed up with Bloomberg, Google and The Guardian to create a forum where people from lots of different worlds and industries could come together to debate and to discuss the big ideas that were going to shape the future of the arts, the future of culture. So we had people on stage from NASA to Disney to the British Museum to Mike Bloomberg, the Mayor of New York, all these people with different perspectives on what are the new business models, how do we think about reinventing marketing in the arts, how do we think about looking at new forms of income generation. So you can check all of that out separately, and they happen each year in London, New York, Sydney and Dubai. And here's some pretty pictures, as promised, of some of the people that spoke at New York. So I'll hand over to Simon quickly.
So in terms of what we mean by cultural entrepreneurship, it's really about the end outcome that you can see on the slide in front of us. It's about revenue and audiences. And we have a fundamental belief that its strategies use the same strategies to achieve both new audience development and monetization, or new revenue, new commercial income. It's the same process, it's the same principles that go into achieving new audiences and new revenue sources. And those processes and principles are really sort of outlined in this equation. It's really understanding who we are as organizations, really understanding what assets we have, whether that's our content assets, whether it's our space assets, whether it's our people assets, the expertise we have, whether it's our networks, the people that are engaged with us as organizations, and then fundamentally understanding what the consumer is up to on a day-to-day basis. What are they doing at home? What are they doing at work? What are they doing in the high street? And how can we take those core consumer trends, take what we do as organizations in the cultural sector, and put the two together to create new opportunities for cultural entrepreneurship? It's really about taking what we do best as a cultural sector and placing it slap bang in the middle of people's everyday lifestyles. That creates opportunities for cultural entrepreneurship. And then we've got enough research over the last few decades from education into entrepreneurial strategies that actually we've got some really, really good understanding of what makes ideas most likely to happen, what makes the best environments and the right understanding to get from idea to reality. And that includes things like staff culture, it includes things like financial models, it includes things like marketing and niche marketing techniques, but actually just taking it from that idea in our head, we've all got thousands of ideas, how do we take it from that idea to actually making it happen? And really for us, if you understand what your consumer is and what your user is and fundamentally understand what they're interested in, you can take them on that journey. One of the key things we want to stress, this isn't about lowest common denominator. If you've got a great relationship with your audience, with your user, you can take them on a journey and stretch their imagination to new places, as many commercial brands do as well. It's knowing who they are, having that trusted relationship with them, and then guiding them on a journey of discovery through your content.
So we've taken that approach and those principles and applied them to lots of different clients that we've worked with. Some of those are commercial organizations like Skype or the Evening Standard in the media space. We've worked with organizations like Google on the setup of their new cultural institute in Paris. And also, charities, like Amnesty International, but also lots of organisations within the cultural and heritage sector, from, Tate Modern to the Houses of Parliament. So we're now going to look at where we're seeing some of these trends come into play in terms of where organisations, across the cultural sector, from individuals to institutions, are starting to deploy some of these tactics. And I think crucially, both for-profit and not-for-profit organisations that are creating these really interesting cultural experiences and tapping into these trends. So the first one we want to look at is the growth of the idea of cultural content as truly multi-channel. And obviously, we mentioned organisations like Disney or National Geographic that have been fantastic at looking at how a content or an experience plays across lots of different channels to think about consumers in different spaces. And I think some of this is driven, I think this is really positive and empowering for the cultural sector, by the growth in what you might term alternative content. So Picture House, who are one of the organisations named at the bottom there, they're the leading independent art house cinema chain in the UK, on a huge growth curve themselves thanks to kind of VC funding. But they're now finding that between 15 to 20% of their revenue is coming from alternative content. So that's things like live art experiences, opera and cinemas, increasingly things like exhibitions in cinemas, so stuff like Pompeii Live, which was just under 500,000 box office takings. If you take a slightly more commercial position, Billy Elliot, the live experience of the music, became the first alternative content live arts experience to hit #1 in the whole UK box office, which is incredibly impressive. So some of these things are being played out in cinemas that are showing the trends, are saying, well, you know, as well as that exhibition, how do you create a live experience of that in a completely different forum? If you look at another art house cinema, Curzon, they've also taken that into other areas such as their app for smart TVs. So they're releasing films to their members, both, you know, going to the cinema, but also you can get it through their Samsung Smart TV app, which is really, really interesting. The British Film Institute, the BFI, have taken a similar approach. So about a year ago, they launched the BFI player. So this is about saying there's a certain amount of free content which comes from their archive as part of their sort of public remit, but there's also paid for access to some content, and also they're doing some of their you know, their live cinematic releases where they're involved as a funder supporter direct to that audience through the player. So we're seeing this both in, you know, growth areas such as cinema, which again has become a growth area interestingly, but obviously through new devices such as smart TV, or obviously directly through you know, apps, etc. Another growth area, you know, if you're seeing the interest in this content, is areas that have been very much exploited in other industries. So there's been a big growth and a lot of interest in areas like multi-channel networks. So Rightster are one of the biggest players in this area. So they have a series of channels across YouTube where they're aggregating lots of smaller channels. So for example, areas like comedy, sport, and they have 371 million views per month. And fascinating, they've just announced a partnership with Arts Council England, the UK government body for culture, a 1.8 million partnership to create the first multi-channel network for the arts. So this is kind of hot off the press. It was only announced a few weeks ago, and they're speaking about it at the London Remix in December. But I think this is really interesting because this is an area which obviously has generated advertising revenues for individuals that are part of things like their comedy and their sports networks. Will that prove to be the case for the arts as well? Because actually, if you look at YouTube, there aren't that many hits at the moment in terms of the art space. If you take a broader definition of what you might term arts and culture, you can find some more interesting stuff. But actually working with an organisation that very successfully has grown audiences in other areas, applying some of those skills, that expertise to the arts, is going to be interesting to watch.
And then we've got the example of digital theatre, which is a really good example of how a business can scale, how an organisation can scale. This is a for-profit provider that's created an aggregation of theatre content internationally. And it's quite an interesting area that not only are they creating that aggregator model and really exploring how to bring different organisations together for one gateway for that audience, but also they're really exploring the supply side and perfecting, they're all ex-BBC guys, and they're perfecting the ability to create content based on the live theatre performance, but filmed in quite interesting ways that really capture the kind of the best of that digital experience, and not just trying to create a flat representation of a theatre show, but actually really engaging with the process of filming it. And interestingly, most important of all, it's just received, or a couple of years back, it received VC backing from Ingenious Media, which is one of the backers of Avatar, and an incredible sort of VC company with its background in other cultural projects as well. But interestingly, it's showing that because there's such significant consumer demand for these kind of channels, it's becoming mainstream business to invest in these kind of opportunities, and actually it really starts to show the appetite for cultural content across that kind of national network.
I'd say with Ingenious, they're quite an interesting one because they've created a specific fund of 20 million for the arts and creative industries. And what's great about this as well is the reviews that they're getting for this content has been fantastic. So to Simon's point earlier, you know, can you combine great art experiences, or in this case, great representations and capturing of an arts experience with a viable revenue model? I think it's very possible to do that. And what's crucial about it is the skills of the team. So the two people behind this are ex-BBC guys, so they're clearly expert in actually the kind of, you know, creating a high quality sort of cinematic experience almost of this theatrical content, but obviously with the networks, with the connections within that world to make sure they can actually bring that together with the production quality.
And taking it a step further still in terms of content, actually creating that experience around the content, similar to some of the cinema examples earlier, Secret Cinema is a fantastic example of the whole live experience built around the kind of the core content asset. And Fabian Riggle, the founder of Secret Cinema, is talking at our event in December in London and was at our New York event in September. And it was really interesting hearing him speak around this idea of, they had 80,000 visitors, so an incredible turnout for their recreation of Hill Valley, the set of Back to the Future in London. So it really kind of showing how they took a very interesting storytelling universe and converted it into opportunities to engage with that universe on so many different levels, not just the content on screen, but also engagement through the theatrical immersive experience, through the stores you could buy from, through the engagement with actors wandering around, and the whole series of different channels you could engage with that on.
I think this is really relevant to some of the workshops and pilots that we've been having as part of this project. We talked about, you know, the future of the book as an experience that's beyond just the content itself on the pages or even the digital content. And what Fabian said, which is really key for me, was they've now got 4 million followers across their different channels, because actually, whereas Back to the Future, as we know, is a fairly commercial representation of cinema, what he's really passionate about is emerging short filmmakers. So he has channels on YouTube like Future Shorts. So there's an audience around what he does, which is 4 million, because he's been able to sort of scale it over the last sort of 6 or 7 years. And then he's using that audience to obviously monetize that relationship with these offline experiences. So the kind of the digital and the offline are completely interrelated. And to Simon's point, 80,000 people paying to go and see that production translated to £3.5 million worth of revenue. So that's just the tickets. That's not even what they took in terms of food and drink, and people spent hours in this recreation of Hill Valley, which I went along to. It was in the Olympic Park, or the former Olympic Park area in London. You know, they even built the famous courthouse, which got struck by lightning. You know, it was on a really epic scale, and I think that shows where you get creative entrepreneurs that have got really big ideas. If you can find a market for this, and I think 80,000 people paying to go there tells you that actually even in a digital world, people are also seeking this counter trend. You know, for every trend there's a counter trend. In this case, getting real experiences is what he tapped into, but that interrelation between digital and physical. Sorry, I'm still on. Another one, and perhaps this is sort of slightly better known, but it's one which is dear to our heart because we've got the same venture capital funder as Retronaut. And Chris Wilde, I think, is interesting because he's somebody who very much comes from the cultural sector. So he's a former archivist. I think it's fair to say he's a frustrated archivist, and he felt that perhaps archives weren't taking advantage of the opportunities that the digital revolution provided. And really what he wanted to create was an interaction with users that would be very engaging and would scale very quickly. So he came up with the idea because he was a curator, he was very visually literate, and he felt he could spot interesting and arresting images, of sending each day his users a time capsule which would, you know, because Chris actually personally sort of doesn't want to live in the current era, he sort of wants to live in the past. So his way of experiencing, I guess being kind of Doctor Who, was to live through these images. So each day he would send people a time capsule, and that might have been, you know, behind the scenes on a David Bowie video, it might be pictures of, you know, to take the Doctor Who reference, the Daleks in the corner there, you know, it could be a kind of monorail. And actually what was fascinating was people responded in huge numbers. So if you add together his Facebook and his Twitter following, you know, it's in the low hundreds of thousands. You know, he's generating millions of page views each month. He's created a brand actually out of Retronaut. That allowed him to attract venture capital funding because obviously he was getting a scale of traffic that brought in advertising. And then most recently, to see the full iteration of that brand, he's just had his first book published by National Geographic, to sort of go back to that link again. So I think that's a really, really interesting example of where it's not without controversy. So what he's doing is he's grabbing images from all over the internet. We've had obviously a number of talks about issues relating to rights. He's sort of choosing not to worry about that to a certain extent and work on the basis that actually users want this stuff, so he can be an aggregator of that content. And what's fascinating is because he's found a model which is engaging to the end user and in really large numbers, he's now found that he's becoming one of the biggest referrers of traffic to some fairly serious you know, national museums in the UK. So it's sort of coming full circle, whereas, you know, obviously people were initially, and probably still are to a certain extent, uncomfortable with the rights issues. Because he's actually using that content, arguably, in digital terms anyway, in a more effective way than they are to generate new audiences, the referral back to their sites has actually made him really quite an important part of the landscape. Another example is just to take a sort of slightly different platform, and I think this one's a powerful one because it shows that actually you can charge for digital content where you create something of quality. And people may have come across TouchPress. They're definitely pioneers in terms of app development, and some of the sort of the apps that Apple used to advertise the iPad and the iPhone initially, they were behind. So they're involved in Bjork's famous app album, which was obviously a new way of sort of using the app format. They produced wonders of the solar system, Warhorse, a lot of sort of I guess kind of bigger budget mainstream apps. But actually, as kind of experts in that field, the project that I want to talk about is The Wasteland, T.S. Eliot's poem. It's quite a challenging piece, probably definitely not what you would tackle if you were looking to be that sort of #1 in the box office. But a huge amount of sort of love and effort went into creating an app which allowed you to sort of peel back the layers of that poem to really understand it through a variety of different voices, really using the archived material of Faber and Faber, the publishers and the holders of the copyright of that particular poem. And that actually was rewarded in that they decided deliberately they would charge a high price. I'm trying to think what the euro translation would be, but it was around about sort of £12 in UK terms. And within 6 weeks, they had made their money back, which I think is really, really interesting in terms of a company that generally is at that kind of top of the box office end of app production, but taking on a sort of an artistic and cultural content, applying those sort of skills to it, and saying actually you can charge for quality. If you do something which is really, really great, the audience will respond to that. And then we thought we'd also be interesting to look at some sort of new business models and entirely new possibilities that are becoming forward through digital and the monetization mechanisms, if you want to call it that. So I don't know if people come across Sedition. So Sedition for me is interesting because it's tackling this new form of, or certainly evolving form of digital art. And again, it's done from quite a commercial perspective. So the idea they had was to create an online platform for digital art in the same way as you have the sale of digital art in places like auction houses and galleries offline. So they brought together some of the world's best known artists, so people like Damien Hirst, Tracy Emin are part of this platform, got them to create digital artworks which were available to buy, so you could see them through your smart TV, through your iPad, through your iPhone. But what was fascinating about it is they created almost an iTunes or a Vault type technology. So once these editions started to sell out, and it was actually quite democratic, you could buy your digital version of a Damien Hirst for £50. There would be 10,000 of those artworks in the edition, and they're actually selling out now, which is really, really interesting. But like the offline art market, once they sell out, you've obviously got scarcity because of this Vault technology, which means only you can own that digital edition. So you can then resell it at a higher value if that's what you want to do with your artwork. So it's creating that sort of collecting model in a digital space. And again, it's unlocked VC funding. This has 500,000 Facebook fans. Again, show you the kind of scale that this has got to. And what's really, really interesting about it is how it plays out in different parts of the world and obviously a global digital marketplace. So this has become actually much bigger in Asia, where increasingly people are starting to see screens as the new walls. So whereas initially I thought about this, is this actually just about buying a kind of piece of wallpaper or a screensaver? Actually, as people start to change their view of actually what's the canvas, then these things become really, really interesting. But it requires pioneers to obviously make that leap.
About 6 years or so ago, we were involved with a project with Tate Modern and Wallpaper Magazine, looking to create new product ideas from the content in their collections. And it was quite an interesting challenge where we did a crowdsourced product development competition. We put it out to the community to say, here is what Tate stands for, here is Tate's assets, here's Tate's collections, come back to us with product ideas through a competition mechanic. And we then had a jury of the great and good, as well as social voting, to decide on which of those competition entries should go through to go into production. And it's quite interesting seeing the release competition, and then as well, another example very similar to this is Reich Studio, which a few years ago was launched by Rijksmuseum, looking at opening up their content to allow people to remix it, reuse it, and upload their interpretations of that content. And Rijksmuseum also did a very interesting collaboration with Etsy in a similar manner to the release competition around creating new product ideas, new product development ideas based on their collections. So really kind of taking that core asset of a collection and leveraging it across lots of different channels, including retail.
So again, thinking about other ways of sort of monetizing content, and I guess again it's very relevant to some of the workshops and conversations we've been having, where you've got something like Blipper, you know, probably the leaders in the space of augmented reality. They collaborated with Richard Reed, who was the founder of Innocent Drinks. Innocent in the UK are very well known as the kind of leading smoothie brand, and recently he'd sold it to Coca-Cola, which was quite controversial because he was kind of like the anti-Coca-Cola person. But as an entrepreneur who'd obviously been handed a big pile of cash, he talked about Remix, about how he wanted to engage in sort of venture philanthropy, so supporting projects that he was passionate about. He had this idea when he walked down his street that, you know, he looked at a billboard, there was probably an advert of Coca-Cola on there, and he said, well, what if we basically had art on that billboard? And then, you know, because he was an entrepreneur, he had a big idea. He said, well, what if we put art on every billboard in the UK, and we can create the UK's largest ever art exhibition? He kind of pulled into a room the major sort of advertising companies, managed to get his hands on 25,000 billboards, and then brought together a group of art partners like Tate and the Art Fund to then populate it. But as part of that project, if you used the Blipper app, you could put your phone against the artwork and get, you know, author talks, you know, contextual additional information through the augmented reality experience of that exhibition. And what was fascinating about it is, although obviously in this sense, you know, Blipper were using it for an art project, sometimes the technology that's created, it may allow access or free access to the arts content, but then maybe it's the relationship with a brand or a third party, which then obviously provides the sort of monetization and the business model behind it, which is very much what Blipper are doing. They're working with lots of different brands and organizations, but the platform itself obviously can be used in a variety of different ways. So that's really, really interesting in terms of some of the conversations we were having around workshops. It's also just gone to America, which is great. Again, shows how these things can scale really, really quickly, and it's double the size. So this thing has taken America by storm, which is really great to see.
And just one final point on Blipper, which is really interesting, is that similar to some of the previous examples, it's that kind of new art form, creating new opportunities for artists to get creative with augmented reality. A lot of the examples that they show clients tend to be quite traditional sort of video content or sort of pop-up experiences coming out of content, whereas actually they're really excited to be working with artists and getting artists and creatives engaged in what this technology can provide. If in effect it can be animated and created digitally, it can be used through AR, and that creates some really interesting experiences, particularly when you then put something like Oculus Rift, or in a lo-fi version of that, Google Cardboard into the equation. Google Cardboard, look it up if you've not come across that. That's a great kind of homemade Oculus Rift that Google launched a few months back. Some really, really exciting new challenges and new opportunities for content creators as we get into that immersive environment of AR. So moving on to another sort of example, this idea of it's not just about the content, but it's about the user and it's about the context of that content as well. And ArtStack's a great example, kind of really capitalizing on the examples of things like Pinterest, where everyone has got this obsession with collecting, and Pinterest has been an incredible way of kind of tapping into that collecting mentality of users. ArtStack is an example where instead of it being open across lots of different areas, it's specific to art. It's about collecting your art history, finding the best pieces that you like, and then sharing those with friends, following friends and curators that you trust, and using that as a great source of community, of finding the next artist, the next artwork, and really then sort of engaging on a social basis around filtering up the best art. And really that kind of user demand for collection, for creating their own capsules, and then for also allowing their author, their sort of networks to view what they're most interested in, and they're ensuring that others can come back and see what their latest finds are.
Okay, so we're moving away from the examples now to sort of finish up in terms of, you know, where do these ideas come from, and crucially, how do we resource them? So I think what's what's apparent is there are actually now a number of spaces in different locations around the world which are about bringing artists and technologists together. Now, often those spaces don't necessarily have commercial imperatives at the heart of what they're doing. So, you know, the top image there is of the Google Cultural Institute in Paris, the project that we worked on. So that's very much about creating, you know, salons, spaces for conversations between these different worlds in a similar way to something like Remix. The space below is Blank, which is in East London, which is the you know, pretty much the biggest tech cluster now in Europe, where you've obviously got lots of kind of creative entrepreneurs and tech startups in and around sort of that Shoreditch area in East London. And Blank is a collaboration between a number of those sort of startups and the V&A about creating a space which isn't within the V&A, although the V&A as a partner is not the curator of that space, and it's a space for experimentation. And then, you know, probably the most high-profile one sort of outside of Europe would be something like New Ink. So this amazing piece of architecture, if you don't know, is the New Museum in New York. And New Ink is a space, again, where artists and technologists can come together, a kind of co-working space for the arts. So there are a number of these. And what that's allowing is experimentation. I think we've got somebody, or we did have somebody here from the British Library, but there are some areas which are still yet to be monetized, but I think are areas that we would point to for sort of further exploration. So, you know, the British Library organised a competition recently which was about getting academics, developers, people that are interested in, and taking a sort of physical map from their archive and turning that into a more engaging sort of immersive experience by using the engine behind the kind of Crisis title of games. And that led to this fantastic recreation of kind of medieval London. And obviously in a world of, you know, Grand Theft Auto, where suddenly you have these huge open worlds, or even in independent sectors, you know, things like Minecraft, the British British Museum have just announced that they're recreating the museum in Minecraft. There are lots of opportunities, I think, to go where, in effect, the audience are people that aren't necessarily going to step into museums or geographic aren't able to do that. And I think these spaces that are allowing people to come together to have new types of creative partnerships, even if initially commercial isn't the output, I think that comes anyway because you're putting people together from different worlds who are going to think in new ways.
So really, as well as that kind of incubation and support network, it's also really interesting to think about the financial model underpinning it and who now can support us in very different ways around financially underpinning some of these ideas. Now, there are so many different options on the table now. It's no longer waiting for the public check to land on our doorstep, which never arrives incidentally. It's quite interesting to get involved with crowdfunding, crowd equity, venture funding, debt funding, a whole range of different opportunities where with demand-led innovation that's got a demand from a consumer or user audience, we can actually get alternative sources of finance to create those exciting new cultural opportunities. So some examples there, in terms of crowdfunding, the Lion Sculpture Walk, for example, in London created £140,000 worth of income within 8 weeks to create the first sculpture walk in London. Or similarly, we got crowd equity, where in the background, you can't really see it, but it's the new Craftsman, which represents 75 makers across very traditional industries, such as silverware, textile manufacture, a whole range of others. They raised £150,000 through a crowd equity platform, where people believed enough in the business model of actually creating a premium source of items, luxury, handcrafted crafts pieces, that they were willing to invest in that as a business opportunity, even though, and especially because the end result was then putting more money into the hands of those makers and creatives. And then debt funding is quite an interesting one, and there's been a lot of this, there's been a lot of developments in the UK around this, so particularly through organisations like Creative United, which have just launched a new microfinance scheme for creative enterprise, really looking at small financial loans, which can always be part of the financial mix when we've got enough demand for what we're creating. So some really interesting opportunities there. And then finally, we've mentioned some examples like Ingenious around VC funding, funding. Similar sort of Triodos Bank, which has got a huge investment program and sort of loans program for ethical and social startups as well. An incredibly interesting bank that has as much emphasis on the cultural outputs and the social outputs as it does on the commercial outputs. But interesting, one of the things we're finding, and Ingenious' investment in a studio of designer makers was a great example of this, is the commercial returns that Ingenious got in terms of the loans that they provided for this particular artist studio were really good in comparison to some of the commercial returns they got elsewhere. And that's because the artists in the studios always paid their rent on time, always came back, and always it was a much more secure sort of loan for them on a commercial basis than it was for some of their other clients. And it's quite interesting to actually start to stack up these commercial arguments in order to generate these new sources of finance as well.
What I would just sort of add on that as well is there's a recent stat came out that in terms of kind of art startups or culture startups, if you want to call them, and VC funding, over the last years there's been over $250 million worth of funding for, in effect, enterprises that at their heart, clearly have a commercial dividend. That's why they're generating that sort of venture capital investment in a similar way to Culture Label. The funders or the investors want them to scale and do well. But clearly a number of these, like, in arts or in art space, some of the ones that we haven't even mentioned, you have a cultural dividend as well because they're taking art to new audiences. And also, Simon mentioned in terms of that crowd equity example, people are investing in some of these businesses because they're wanting to get beyond the kind of the high street names and invest with businesses that sometimes have more of a social purpose, or even if they're purely commercial, have a brand that they can get a bit more passionate about, to take something like that sort of innocent example. So I think sort of we'll all be fairly familiar with the fact there's a lot of incubation spaces, but we were asked recently to do a report for the City of London on opportunities for creative entrepreneurship within the City of London. And our thought was, obviously it's great that there are spaces that are coming together, and the Barbican, who are one of the organisations funded by the City of London, are a great example of people who have done this. So a few years ago they did Hack the Barbican, where they encouraged that technology community of East London to come in and basically kind of rip apart the Barbican and come up with lots of exciting new ideas about what they could do and new types of collaborations and possibilities. That led them into a collaboration with the Trampery, which is a fashion-based co-working space in London who organised Hack the Barbican. That's now led to them taking a space in the former Olympic Park in London called Fish Island Labs, which is another one of these co-working spaces. But the gap we identified was, if you look to areas like Silicon Valley, there are a lot of co-working spaces, but the bit that got us really excited was the notion of an accelerator. So accelerators are slightly different in that what you're doing is working with a small group of organizations that might be 15, 20 startups that you've identified as having potential. And you're bringing them together because you recognize that they all have similar needs. So they might need certain types of finance advice. They might need certain types of legal advice. There may be similar sort of technical issues they're facing. It might be about how you connect them with funding. But something like Techstars, which is perhaps the best known example coming out of Silicon Valley, is about how can you accelerate their growth really, really quickly. So if you take that fact, there's 250 million going into kind of art startups, where do the next generation come from? And our view is that they're coming out of some of these co-working spaces or elsewhere. How do you take a number of them on a journey that you would take any technology startup on? Actually, that's a really good route to help them monetize and grow their business a lot quicker. So again, that report's free to read, so you can check that out.
And that's particularly interesting with entrepreneurship examples, where when it's an interesting idea that comes up within an organisation, how do you create the right strategies and opportunities to spin it out, or take some examples from the education sector where we can give it the freedom and the room for growth and really fulfilling its potential. And we're doing quite a bit of work at looking at that, how organisations, more traditional sort of institutions, can harbour some interesting startups being spun out of them. So then finally, change is definitely coming from four corners, and we sort of categorise it as these four areas. It's that sort of internal innovation where entrepreneurship within institutions, driven by change makers, driven by people with a real passion for the content, the technology, and the entrepreneurial vision that they have within an organisation, really start to make change happen within their institution. Secondly, it's coming from creative entrepreneurs, people outside the sector that see the great assets we've got as cultural institutions and actually just come and work with organisations organisations or come and work around organisations to use those assets in new and interesting ways. And fourthly, looking at disruptors, the idea of people that impact us from outside the sector. We talked yesterday about Amazon Kindle being a great example of this, that's completely redefined the public library, the rules around lending and what's valid in terms of lending opportunities with public libraries. Actually, it's happening whether or not the public library sector get involved or were involved, but it's happening outside of the creative sector, and it's just being aware of those disruptive influences that have a core impact on our business models as institutions. But then fourthly and finally, this kind of idea of remixers, which is the area we get most excited about. People who spot and identify trends in other sectors or other areas and just simply apply them, just simply take that idea and place it onto the cultural and creative industries and use that as a way of really driving innovation. When we've got tried and established models and opportunities in other sectors that haven't yet been applied to culture and creativity, how can we take those and apply them internally? And a lot of that is about getting the conversation flowing between culture, tech and entrepreneurship in order to really understand what we are as organisations, what's going on out there, and what opportunities are available to create those new audiences and revenue streams. Okay, that's it. Sorry we've gone on a bit too long, but we hope there's some interesting examples in there, and look forward to seeing what you do with it over the next few weeks and months. Thanks.
Thank you, Few. We are running late. We're going to have no more than 5 minutes break. I'm sorry, because we need to just try and get ourselves back on schedule. So 5 minutes, we're going to be back in here, and we will start at exactly